In this ongoing series, I aim to chart the entire history of one of humankind's most spectacular art forms, animation. In this part, we'll discuss the influence of comic strips on early animation and the groundbreaking works of Winsor McCay. This is the evolution of cartoons. Part 5, Winsor McCay and Gertie the Dinosaur. The early life of Winsor McCay is quite mysterious. His exact birth date is believed to be between the middle 1860s and the early 1870s, and while he is commonly considered to be American-born, some scholars set his birthplace in Canada. What we do know is that McCay was a keen, skillful and prolific artist from a young age. McCay was a talented memory sketcher, able to precisely draw from memory, a skill he would showcase at New York City's dime museums, establishments showcasing a wide array of entertainments, performances and eclectic exhibitions of curiosities. McCay grew a reputation as an expert portrait artist, selling them to museum visitors. From the late 1880s, likely in his 20s, McCay crafted posters, pamphlets and other advertisements for various locales, spending more than a decade as an advertising artist. All the while, he continued to perform at dime museums across America, gathering huge crowds impressed with his artistic prowess. It was at the Cincinnati Dime Museum in 1896 when McCay likely experienced his very first motion picture, with Thomas Edison exhibiting his revolutionary Vitascope, a large projector utilised in the theatrical distribution of films produced by the Edison Company. By 1888, as an artist, McCay was working for the Cincinnati Commercial Tribune and freelancing for Life magazine. In 1900, he became the head of the Cincinnati Enquirer's art department. For each magazine, he produced an exhaustive number of illustrations and editorial cartoons. Inspired by the Art Nouveau movement, he began developing a recognisable style, utilising hatchwork and thick lines, and began to explore perspective and depth. In 1903, McCay began crafting comic strips for the Enquirer. The comic strip had emerged in London in the late 1700s as simple strips of comic figures, or caricatures, complemented by humorous captions. By the early 1800s, they took the form of strips of sequential scenes presented in boxes. By the late 1800s, these comic strips were appearing in newspapers and magazines around the globe, becoming an incredibly prevalent form of visual storytelling. They exploded into popularity in America, with comics such as Hogan's Alley featuring the Yellow Kid, the Katzenjammer Kids, the Little Bears, and Lady Bountiful spawning across the previous decade. Comics would soon become a goldmine for future filmmakers and animation artists. In 1904, McCay moved to New York City, where he would produce a number of long-running strips for publications such as the New York Herald and the New York Evening Telegram. His work grew from substantial to prolific. In that year alone, McCay debuted his first continuing strip, Mr. Goodenough, the highly popular Little Sammy Sneeze, and the groundbreaking, long-running Dream of the Rarebit Fiend. The latter was a series of standalone strips focusing on weird, wacky, and surrealist dreams encountered by one-shot characters. The strip was so popular and influential that it was adapted into the 1906 live-action film Dream of a Rarebit Fiend by film pioneer Edwin S. Porter. In 1905, McCay launched spin-off strip Little Nemo in Slumberland, focusing on the fantastical dreams of the titular character. Presented in full colour, Little Nemo is often considered McCay's masterwork. Though it was aimed at children, unlike the more adult black and white Rarebit, the strip was a showcase of McCay's continually more elaborate and experimental art style, highly influencing the art form. Following the immense success of Nemo, McCay attempted to have the strip adapted into a theatrical production, though failed. He instead launched his own travelling vaudeville act, which he toured between 1906 and 1907. The act was another way for McCay to show off his talents, performing chalk talks, where he would draw 25 sketches in only 15 minutes. He continued to pen his strips backstage and in hotel rooms. A highly successful and extravagant Little Nemo stage show would arise in 1907, produced on a budget of $100,000, the equivalent of $3.4 million in 2025. Keen to expand his act, McCay was always looking for inspiration. While at home in 1909, he observed his son playing with a flipbook, a booklet with sequential images printed on each successive page, which created the illusion of movement, or animation. McCay was shot by a bolt of inspiration, saying he came to see the possibility of making moving pictures. He would make an animated cartoon. By late 1910, McCay had produced a series of 4,000 sequential cardboard-mounted sketches drawn on translucent rice paper, which allowed him to trace the previous frame and make minor adjustments. Likely impressed by the work of filmmaker J. Stuart Blackton, an early animation pioneer behind 1900's The Enchanted drawing and 1906's Humorous Phases of Funny Faces, McCay enlisted his help to oversee the photography of the film at his Vitagraph Studios. Blackton also oversaw the filming of live-action bookend sequences, which starred McCay as himself. Little Nemo was released theatrically on April 8, 1911, and was incorporated into his vaudeville act only days later to huge acclaim. This positive response even convinced McCay to return to his drawings and hand-colour them, making the film the first hand-drawn colour animation. McCay later claimed that he had created the very first animated cartoon and marketed himself as the inventor of the animated drawing, despite Blackton and Emile Cohl, the filmmaker behind 1908's Fantasmagorie, having clearly beaten him to the punch. Animation historian and McCay biographer John Canemaker even observed that McCay drew huge inspiration from both of their films, saying he combined the interactive qualities of Blackton's with the abstract, shape-shifting qualities of Cohl's. What he did create, however, was the first animated cartoon based on an existing comic strip character. However, his film did, inarguably, use a highly more refined and expressive character animation than the others, making the film stand out from the bunch. For the film, McCay pioneered various techniques, such as cycled animation, where drawings were repeated for repetitive movement, frame numberings to prevent images being photographed out of order, and registration marks to keep images photographed in alignment without jitters. 1 month later, McCay quit the New York Herald to produce his comics for William Randolph Hearst, the owner of the country's largest media chain of the era. He also began work on his next cartoon, How a Mosquito Operates, based on a Rarebit Fiend strip. The 6-minute-long, 6,000-drawing film debuted exclusively in McCay's vaudeville act in January 1912. It was so popular, Universal Studios head Carl Laemmle bought rights to distribute it theatrically following its retirement in McCay's performance. Universal released it to theatres in 1916 as Winsor McCay and his Jersey Skeeters. In contrast to Nemo, Mosquito was a largely realistic piece of animation, though still lent on elements of exaggerated character comedy. With the film, McCay displayed a naturalistic movement, absolutely groundbreaking for the art form. It was, however, so realistic, many skeptics believed he had traced photos of mosquitoes. To prove he hadn't used any trickery, McCay set out to make a cartoon about a creature that could only be drawn: a dinosaur. These ancient creatures had only recently captured public imagination, with the first skeleton put on display in 1868 in Philadelphia. A brontosaurus skeleton had been erected in New York in 1905, causing a frenzy. McCay was so enamored by dinosaurs, he had included them in many of his comic strips. In his dogged pursuit of realism, McCay even enlisted New York's American Natural History Museum and the American Historical Society to consult on the realistic movements of dinosaurs. Unsurprisingly, they were unable to help. Instead, McCay drew inspiration from his own body, studying and mimicking his movements to realistically draw and time rhythmic breathing and shifting weight. The 5-minute-long film was incorporated into McCay's vaudeville act beginning in February 1914, this time featuring a wholly radical interactive element. McCay timed the film so that he, while live on stage, could interact with the live Gertie on the screen, asking her to answer questions, perform tricks, and obey commands. For the film's finale, McCay would enter the screen and ride off on Gertie's back. Gertie was instilled with a whimsical, precocious personality. As animation historian Jim Korkis said, she was shy, stubborn, petulant, sensitive, playful, and curious, all within 5 minutes. While Gertie wasn't, as is often claimed, the first original cartoon character, she is commonly considered the first with a distinct and appealing personality, and arguably the first cartoon celebrity. The film also incorporated other creatures, including a sea serpent, a mammoth, and a flying lizard, which was cleverly used to distract audiences during a sequence featuring some potentially unrealistic dinosaur movements. The skit was so unlike anything that had ever been seen before. McCay claimed that dubious audience members initially thought that Gertie was a papier-mâché animal with men inside of it, in front of a scenic background. In fact, Gertie the Dinosaur was the first cartoon with detailed backgrounds, for which McCay hired 18-year-old assistant animator John A. Fitzsimmons to exhaustively resketch each of the cartoon's 10,000 plus drawings utilizing rice paper. It was additionally the first cartoon to utilize the McCay split system, where he first drew major poses and positions, now known as keyframes, before filling the gaps with in-betweens. With this system, McCay found his animation became smoother and timing more accurate. Refusing to patent the system to make life easier for future animators, the technique would become a standard of all animation production, where at major studios, keyframes would be drawn by lead animators and in-betweens by assistant in-betweeners. Gertie was naturally a highly popular and hugely influential attraction. Producer William Fox of the box office attractions company, later Fox Film Corporation, successfully bid to distribute Gertie to theatres, albeit in a modified version. Fox extended the film by 7 minutes with a live-action prologue and epilogue featuring McCay, and placed intertitles into the sections where McCay would perform live on stage. It was released to theatres in November of 1914. The film was also subject of a bootleg version, which began screening a couple of years later. With lax or non-existent copyright laws at the time, bootlegs and unofficial replicas were unfortunately very common. Many historians attribute the bootleg Gertie to cartoonist and filmmaker John Randolph Bray, who had fraudulently patented many of McCay's processes, taking advantage of his good nature. With documentation on early cinema very scarce, for many years this version was erroneously cited as McCay's original. Gertie would also later inspire silent-era comedian and filmmaker Buster Keaton for his 1923 film The Three Ages. William Randolph Hearst was not as impressed with Gertie as the public, banning the publications in his syndicate from advertising McCay's vaudeville show, dissuading theatres, especially those out of state, from booking him. Hearst believed that the act, and his ensuing popularity, was distracting McCay from his cartoons, despite the fact that he never missed a deadline. Fact was, Hearst was incredibly controlling. He would later ban all of his artists from performing in vaudeville and made McCay give up on all paid work outside of the syndicate, forcing him to sign a new contract with a pay rise to cover lost income. Following Gertie, McCay produced 6 more animated films, many of which were never released commercially, and some of which are now lost. Amongst these later cartoons are 1918's 11-minute, 25,000 drawing epic The Sinking of Lusitania, a 1921 adaptation of his Dream of a Rarebit Fiend strip, and 1921's elaborate The Centaurs. Around 1921, McCay began work on a second Gertie film, Gertie on Tour, though only produced 2 minutes of animation. Around this time, Hearst, continually more incensed over McCay's devotion to his animated cartoons, banned him from producing any more. It's unknown what McCay may have achieved had his career continued to blossom, though many years later, in 1955, McCay's son Bob collaborated with Walt Disney on a recreation of the Gertie performance for his Disneyland TV series. Upon his visit, legend says, Disney pointed to his studio complex and said, "Bob, all this should be your father's." However, having seen the rise of the animated cartoon over the decades following his prolific work, McCay died in 1934, bitter over the state of the art form, believing it had become not an art, but a trade. On the next installment, we explore the rise of hand-drawn animation in America and the shift from art to trade, charting the explosion of animated cartoons and the first popular cartoon legends and animation moguls, right here on Evolution of Cartoons.